Well, let's start with the new album scheduled for this February. Congratulations on Conjuring. You must be thrilled with these two performances.
Um, Here it is.
Yes.
uh, yes, and dare I say, the interesting story behind this recording, which, believe it or not, at my advanced age, it is in fact the first release entirely devoted to my music. I mean, I've had lots of other tracks recorded as parts of compilations and other programs put together by various artists. But this is actually my kind of stepping out moment as just me, and it's been a long wait, but I'm not complaining. It's great to have it here. And the interesting story was that Liz Reid, who grew up in Hamilton, and played in the Hamilton Philharmonic Youth Symphony in the 1980s. She tells a beautiful story of her conductor one fine day, one Saturday afternoon during rehearsal, holding up this album, an LP. I think it was around 1985. It was the debut release of Rivka Golani. It was a Center Discs recording under the umbrella of the Canadian Music Center. And it was called Viola Nouveau, which, if you're careful about, gender agreement, and you'll immediately notice that that's a completely fanciful title. But anyway, it's what they came up with. It was an LP containing a number of unaccompanied acoustic viola solos, plus my piece, Favor, which was a live electronic amplified viola, the violist operating volume pedals that routed her signal through a couple of different delay systems, which were then, depending on the combination of the pedals, the circuitry was changeable. And so you could have complex results from these two interacting delay systems. And so, and actually, I'm sorry, I should have actually thought to have that album here to show as well. I don't have it here, but the interesting thing about that Rivka Golani recording was not only was it her debut solo record, the Canadian Music Center at the time was undergoing some change. John Miller, who was the executive director at the time, and who had, I think, a good mind and a good eye for promotion, for getting the word out, heightening visibility of the work of the institution he was leading. He had the idea, well, we're going to be making records, they should look good. And he hired, I don't know if you remember Rivka Golani, but in those days, she was famous for her red boots that she would wear on stage, high boots and striking red. She cut quite a figure. And John had the idea he should hire a fashion photographer to do the photo shoot for the album cover. I mean, in those days, the old CMC before his time, I mean, that's old too now, but, tended to lean towards the institutional look. I mean, it was a non-governmental organization. It was, a service organization promoting the interests of Canadian composers, both established and emerging. And they had only just under John's leadership gotten into the whole business of making recordings, commercial recordings. And John said, well, if we're going to do this, we should do it right. We should make this record look striking, make people feel by buying this record, they were getting something quite special. And so back to Liz Reid, sitting in the viola section of the Hamilton Philharmonic Youth Orchestra. One fine day, her conductor happened to have a copy of this LP, and he held it up and he said, "Does anybody want this?" And with this striking photo of Rivka, and Liz just didn't hesitate to raise her hand and I'll have it. Well, you see, I found out about this many years later when Liz contacted me at the urging of her friend Rose Bolton, who's another string player and a composer, quite a accomplished and noted composer, living here in Toronto. Rose had heard Liz talking about my piece, Favor, which was the only electronic piece on that old LP. Well, Rose said, why don't you just call the guy up, ask him about doing, a performance. This planted a seed in the back of Liz Reid's mind, and after the passage of much time, she took her friend Rose's advice. Rose, of course, is a sometimes on again, off again member of the Canadian Electronic Ensemble. Rose keeps a very busy career going, writing mostly for music for film. Her husband is quite an accomplished filmmaker. But when Rose is with the CEE, of course, we all wait to see what gadgets she's brought along for her electric violin. And so, with this kind of, friendly persuasion, Liz got in touch with me. Now, Liz had, in the meantime, moved to Vermont. She lives with her Canadian husband, who is a math teacher in a private military college in Highfield, Vermont. Very interesting story with their three sons. And Liz has a multifaceted career. She plays in the regional orchestra. She plays in the Vermont Opera. She plays chamber music with a number of different ensembles, including one notable one called Turn Music, which is a contemporary group in Vermont. And so finally she reached out to me. I was happy to receive her call, of course. And the interesting thing was, at the time I was doing a lot of work with McGill University, and Montreal is just north of Burlington. She said to me, "Do you think if I put this all together, would you help me prepare this piece?" And I said, "Well, give me a date. I'm sure I'd do what I can to help." It turns out she then, like, this woman, is not stoppable. She just barrels ahead, and she booked a date in Burlington at a local facility, and kind of a combination, pub/performance space, and it actually worked out that I had been in Montreal just like the week before, and I was able to hop a bus down to Burlington, and we met up. She played the what actually was the American premiere of Favor, which this is by now, a piece that was composed in 1980s, before digital electronics, totally analog a piece. And the other remarkable thing about Liz was, she slowly revealed an aspect of her personality, that she's fascinated with gadgets. She's a real techie, and she is very kind of gentle about this, and very kind of soft spoken. And she said, "Well, I'm not sure I understand how to hook all this stuff up," and we talked it through, and before I know it, she'd actually acquired all the equipment. She'd bought a Roland DC-20 analog Echo, which off of eBay, and it was the Japanese version, so it had a 220-volt power supply associated by a transformer, and she bought all the pedals and the preamps and all this stuff. The interesting thing about that work, Favor, was that even though back in the day it was new, it had this complicated technical setup, but people seemed to be willing to go through all the trouble because they were drawn to the piece. Yeah.
You have seen this evolution in new music, and specifically electronic music, dating back to the early 1970s when you first began working at the University of Toronto and then CBC shortly after.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated to hear your perspective on how this music has evolved. Has it come along the way you expected it to?
Well, okay, so the quick answer is, it was true then, and I think it's still true today. When it comes to electronic music, expect the unexpected. And that's, I think, I got into it partly because there were no rules at the time. As an emerging, still forming creative artist and young composer at the time, I wasn't interested in rules and in barriers. I just wanted to get give my creative voice an outlet. And I did study, composing. I have a composition degree, and I studied everything from species counterpoint to orchestration to 12-tone technique to whatever. But it was in the electronic realm that I think I felt most liberated and most that the possibilities were endless, basically.
Did you have a sense in those days that you were a part of a kind of future style of music?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no question. And not only in the task of writing my own works, wherein the beginning of a new work meant really the beginning of a new language. Like basically, you had to define the language you were going to be working with, and follow it logically and musically, of course, to where it might lead you. And then with the ensemble, also the Canadian Electronic Ensemble, where we did compose fully notated works for instruments and electronics, but also we developed a way of improvising together, a collective composition process. And we were very much aware that this was pretty much unprecedented, and we were shaping through how we interacted and how we shaped the music. We were basically inventing, a kind of like a case study, I guess you could call it, of where this music might go. And and I think it remains to this day. I mean, there are definitely genres within the wider world of electronic music. Everything from some of the historical examples to what they call IDM, to I mean, nowadays, if you use the term in the music industry, if you use the term electronic music, it means a totally different thing, which has been commercialized and marketed, and that's all well and good. But yet, some of the truisms that we came across in the early days, basically, like whenever a new piece of equipment was introduced on the market, it opened the door to a whole flood of new unprecedented pieces, because it was following the lead of what the gear made possible. Your creative use of those possibilities basically was like opening the floodgates to everything your imagination might come up with.
So important point. Sorry to interrupt. It's a really important point that I'm not sure a lot of artists fully appreciate, that analog period of electronic music really dictated a completely different approach to composition relative to where we are now in a digital world.
Yes, no question. And that viola piece is a good example because there were no digital delays in those days. And Rivka being the first, Rivka Golani, the person that asked for favor, uh, uh, she didn't come at it from a technological point of view. She just thought it was interesting that the technology would enable her to create polyphony that a solo artist could interact with. And so, I mean, Roland had introduced this analog echo, which was the technical description of the circuitry is it's called bucket brigade circuitry. So you fill up a capacitor and it empties into another one, and then you fill it up, and as much room as there is in this kind of network of capacitors, spilling a signal, that's the length of the delay that you can work with. And so, and to be honest, to give credit to the performing artists, to have the courage and the willingness to go out there and take a chance with what frankly was unpredictabilities of this technology. As a very enabling factor of the whole story. Rivka was and is, she's still playing, totally fearless when it came to working with electronics. And it's funny now. So then, decades later, when Liz came along, she showed that same quality as a performer. And I must say, I worked in radio producing contemporary music for 40 years at CBC, and I like to say this is a bit of my own kind of spinning of truisms. If I've learned anything in those 40 years, it was to realize that the value that the performer brought to the table in their interpretation and their understanding of the sense of the music, how it would go, basically, I like to say, breathing life into those dots that we put on the page, we composers. I mean, the value of that is enormous. And I've come away from that experience, I think, maybe a bit wiser than I might otherwise have, and in the respect I have for those artists who have the courage and the creativity to take on these works.
Well, that respect is mutual, though. I mean, if you think about your years as both a broadcaster and as a composer, you have been remarkably generous with these colleagues of yours.
Yeah.
What's been the motivation for you?
I guess for me, the principal objective of the whole exercise was just to open doors, open windows, to make it possible to explore creative options. I mean, interacting with some of these really top drawer performers, who have worked in the woodshed, honing their technique and really raising their performance capabilities to a very, very high level. I mean, I've always sort of, I like to say, I had this kind of image, this virtual image of my office at CBC, that there were like two queues of people outside of my office. One was the composers wondering who would play my music, and the other one was these performers saying, what do you have for us to play? And so I did a lot of marriage counseling, I guess, in that, putting together and either making it possible for newly created works to be performed and broadcast, and also commissioning, where for me the best reason to commission was if you were making a program, if you were designing a program for a future broadcast, and you could identify that in the existing repertoire there was a gap, we really needed a piece like such and such, and here's a composer I think would probably be well chosen to provide that piece. So like pieces being created not just out of whim, but for a targeted reason, for a programmatic purpose.
We're always thinking about moving the music forward. It was always about progress. It was always about pushing boundaries.
Right, and finding where there was a need for it, and where the pushing of those boundaries would answer that need in a very creative way.
The thing that fascinates me, though, David, when I think back to music throughout this period, is how fresh so much of it still sounds. There's a kind of timelessness to this music, isn't there? Why do you think that is?
You're opening the door to a very, very big topic here. But I totally agree with you. I mean, I remember who was the pianist? I think it was John Camille Farrar, who I met as he was finishing his performance degree at the University of Toronto and was starting his career. And he wanted to do a recital at the Music Gallery, which at the time Jim Montgomery was the artistic director. And it was actually Jim who introduced John and me. And he wanted to do some of his own stuff, but he also wanted to play Stockhausen, Klavierstück 9. And by this time, like, that music was written in the the late 1950s, early 1960s, and I thought, well, the whole idea as a professional programmer, the whole idea is always to shape something that's interesting. That programming in itself is an art, and you need pieces from different categories to move a program along. And yes, I had exactly that feeling listening to Stockhausen played, pieces 30 years old, sounding fresh and new, and like, this is a unique language. It's a totally it has logic to the ear, and but its own unique personality and artistic point of view. And I think I'm kind of involved with the answer to your question in a way. I remember as a university student, I had come across an article by Arnold Schoenberg, and it was he was quite a prolific essayist, besides his composing and his writing of theoretical texts and so on. But he wondered in an article, it was a very small, like a couple of sentences buried in this larger article. He wondered about the notion of what he called endless variation. And I mean, if you look at Schoenberg's music, you can see, in the kind of the complexity of the counterpoint that he creates, that this would be of great interest. But when I started myself thinking in my own terms about what would be a purpose behind writing a certain melody, say, and it would be to move the music forward, to take you basically on a story, through melody, from the beginning of a piece to the end. And in the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, I've been playing with my own different devices and different approaches and concepts, how I might do this. And there's one piece. Well, okay, so actually there's a piece on Liz's a recording, and it's called Constable and the Spirit of the Clouds. So at one point I was wondering about, like, visual analogs for designing melody. So the idea that a cloud, for example, you look at a cloud and it can be linear, it can have volume and texture, it can be light, dark, and in real time, it's endlessly varying. It just kind of floats by, changing and reforming as it goes. So I started using this just as an analog, just as nothing literal, just as a kind of a process and a concept. What if melody worked that way? Based on whatever comes from the artist himself, like maybe an expressive purpose or a design sense, just moving the music forward through like one interval after the next, and not relying on any kind of harmonic underpinning or any kind of formal plan, but just freely letting it evolve. So that piece on this record, actually, it was originally a cello piece, a cello piece called Constable's Clouds, which was an unaccompanied cello piece. But then Liz heard this and she said, "Do you think we could do a viola version, and could we have electronics with it?" So I applied the existing cello part, and then used a similar process to design electronic voices to go with it. And I said to Liz, at any time during the progress of this piece, I would encourage you to interact with things you hear in the electronic part, because I knew that she's got this. She had revealed to me she really liked improvising. She's, doesn't like to be kind of nailed down too tightly to the score, and so this piece was designed to kind of open that whole thing up, starting on the existing cello piece, and just then adding the electronic element, and opening up the structure for the performance. And she responded to that absolutely brilliantly, and I'm really pleased with what we ended up with.